Everyone. My name is Luciano Astarini Paladino. For those who don't know me, I am part of the integration and trade sector at the Inter-American Development Bank, the IDB. So I would like to welcome you all. So today's sessions, it will be about as you know, the European Green Deal, but today it will be conducted exclusively in English. So for those who prefer to listen to this session in any other language like Spanish or Portuguese, you can activate this live simultaneous interpretation on the Zoom window by clicking on the globe icon that is at the bottom of the Zoom window and select there your preferred language, either Spanish or English, Spanish or Portuguese. And throughout the session, you can leave your questions in the Q&A option in any of the three languages, either Spanish, English or Portuguese. Para los que hablan español, la sesión de hoy se llevará a cabo en inglés exclusivamente, pero tenemos interpretación simultánea en español y en portugués, así que para los que deseen, ahí como dice la pantalla, pueden activar la interpretación simultánea, la traducción en vivo, haciendo clic en el icono del mundo que se encuentra abajo de todo en la ventana de Zoom. Ahí hacen clic, seleccionan el idioma, entonces van a escuchar en vivo mientras las speakers del día de hoy van hablando la sesión en español. Y durante toda la sesión, a medida que ustedes vayan teniendo comentarios o preguntas para las speakers, está la opción de preguntas y respuestas o de Q&A, donde pueden dejar ahí las preguntas también en español, si lo desean, no hay ningún tipo de problema. Y al final de cada una de las dos sesiones del día de hoy, vamos a mandársela a las speakers en inglés y ustedes van a poder escuchar la respuesta en español si tienen activada la interpretação simultânea. E para os brasileiros, o pessoal que fala português, a sessão de hoje vai ser conduzida exclusivamente em inglês. Mas nós hoje temos a interpretação simultânea ao português. Então, se vocês quiserem ouvir a sessão de hoje em português, vão poder fazer clique no ícone do mundo que vocês encontram lá embaixo da janela do Zoom. Aí fazem um clique e podem selecionar o idioma português. Então, durante toda a sessão de hoje, vocês vão poder deixar suas perguntas, se vocês quiserem, aí na opção de perguntas e respostas, também na sessão de Zoom, e podem deixar suas perguntas em português também. Depois, nós vamos fazer para os palestrantes essas perguntas em português, e se vocês já ativaram a opção de interpretação simultânea, vão ouvir a resposta em português. Então, podem começar a ativar a interpretação simultânea em português agora. So now I will switch to English. I hope everyone already activated the simultaneous interpretation in their language. So in case you have any questions about Connect Americas, about the webinar, or about any other activity or benefits that we have in Connect Americas, you can get in contact with me. There on the screen, you can see the QR code to my LinkedIn. So in case you have any doubt or any comment, please feel free to connect with me and ask me any questions there. So today we will talk about the European Green Deal, and we are organizing this program in the context of Bid for the Americas. So Bid for the Americas is the IDB Group's program designed to foster business opportunities and strengthen economic ties between the 26 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean that are part of the IDB and key partners from Europe, North America, and Asia. Bid for the Americas focuses on three main pillars, which are public procurement, trade and investment, and co-financing. So any Connect Americas program, course, activity, or benefit contained in the Bid for the Americas logo, as that is the one that you can see on the screen right now, aims to promote stronger ties and opportunities between our country and our region, Latin America and the Caribbean, with the rest of the IDB member countries from Europe, North America, and Asia. Like today's session about the European Green Deal and how Latin American and Caribbean SMEs can take advantage of this agreement. So to know more about the program, about Bid for the Americas, please, you can scan the QR code that is displayed on the screen and get to know all the activities that we have in the context of the Bid for the Americas program. Now it's time to kick this session off. I would like to invite Ulas Mara to take the lead. Ulas is the head of the International Chamber of Commerce Center of Entrepreneurship, and he will be moderating today's session. So Ulas, it is an honor to be collaborating with you one more time, and to have the ICC here on board this activity, this event. So I'm so happy to have you here today with us, and now the floor is yours.
Thank you, Luciano. I'm looking at the number of participants, and we're already at 656, it seems. fantastic turnout. So thank you all for joining from different parts of the world. And I'm super excited for the session that's going to follow now. Like Luciano said, my name is Ullas. I head the ICC Center of Entrepreneurship. It's a global initiative of the International Chamber of Commerce, or ICC, as it's abbreviated. Based out of Paris, ICC is the institutional representative of more than 45 million companies around the world. And when I say around the world, I mean 170 countries. So that's a massive network. And the work that we do, it influences more than $17 trillion worth of trade every year. This more specifically, the Center of Entrepreneurship currently has a network spanning 16 countries. And what we do is help chambers of commerce and local ICC offices build capacities in the areas of international trade and global competitiveness. What do we mean by global competitiveness? Helping them understand emerging trends in international trade and entrepreneurship. How is artificial intelligence relevant to SMEs? How will the Green Deal, for example, impact SMEs? And such themes, including even inclusion. And we do this by offering three main value propositions. One is our brand, the second is our knowledge, and the third is our global network that I alluded to earlier. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing two experts to this session. One is Tatiana Paisova, who is going to talk to us a bit about the carbon border adjustment mechanism. She's a senior associate at Van Balen Bellis, and Clotilde Duparc, who is going to talk to us about the European Union Deforestation Regulation. She's a partner at Van Balen Bellis. The CBAM, or the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, and the EU Deforestation Regulation, sometimes they're loosely also referred to as the Green Deal, which is nothing but a series of policy reforms aimed at addressing climate change and slowing down any kind of environmental degradation. As these initiatives come into force, there will be implications for small and medium-sized businesses across the world that do business with the EU or hope to do so. And what does this mean in practical terms? That's what we're going to find out today. I'm not the expert, Tatiana is. So Tatiana, the floor is all yours for your presentation, but I'll just leave all of you with one thought. Please be participative, ask as many questions as you can, and do stay in touch even after this workshop. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. And thank you so much, Luciano and Ullas, for the kind introduction and for inviting me to participate and contribute to this truly international workshop. It's really impressive to see all the names, all the countries that are popping up in the chat box. So really, I see people from all over the world participating in this workshop. Ullas and Luciano have asked me to address one of the very important topics for businesses, both in the EU but also outside of the EU, which is the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism. Let me try to share my screen. I hope you can see the correct part of the presentation. Yep. Fantastic. Yep. So for today, in the next 35 to 40 minutes, we will handle the main parts of the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism, including addressing the main obligations that arise for EU importers, but more importantly for non-EU operators that export products that are subject to the EU CBAM to the European Union. And then we will also address the practical implications of this new regulatory framework for small and medium enterprises, which I understand are the key audience of this workshop. So As Ulas has mentioned in his brief introduction, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism is essentially one of the important initiatives that fall within a broader package of the EU initiatives known as the EU Green Deal and the Fit for 55. And the main objective of this initiatives is to enable the European Union to achieve significant greenhouse gas reductions by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2050. So in essence, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism that is introduced by the European Union imposes an obligation to calculate and in the future also to pay for greenhouse gas emissions embedded in certain imported products. The Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism is introduced as an equivalent to the EU emission trading scheme, but for imported products. So as you may know, there is a carbon pricing scheme which operates in the European Union in the form of the EU emission trading scheme. And currently, the EU producers are subject to carbon pricing, which is not necessarily the case for imported products. And hence, with the introduction of the EU Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, the EU essentially aims to create a level playing field for its producers that are subject to carbon pricing. With the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, the EU also aims to address the so-called carbon leakage. The carbon leakage arises in two situations. First, the EU producers of carbon-intensive products may opt to move their production to third countries that do not have carbon pricing in place. This is one situation when carbon leakage may arise. Or also where foreign products that are produced in countries without carbon pricing measures and are more carbon intensive can enter the European Union market at a lower price as compared to the same goods that are produced in the EU and are subject to carbon pricing. And finally, this new Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism also aims to encourage non-EU countries to implement their own carbon pricing. So, as many of you may know, the Carbon Border Adjustment Regulation, which introduces the carbon border adjustment in the EU, has already entered into force. And in fact, we are currently now in the so-called transitional phase. I will speak about the transitional phase in a moment. After the transitional phase, starting from 1st January 2026, the definitive period will start. And the main difference between the definitive period and the transitional period is that the financial obligation to pay for the carbon embedded in the imported product will arise starting from the definitive period, so from the 1st January 2026. It should be noted that the legal framework underpinning the carbon border adjustments in the European Union is, I would say, a living organism. So the key legal acts are there. There is the EU CBAM regulation. There is also the implementing regulation for the transitional period. But for the definitive period, there is still a number of clarifications from the European Union that will be adopted in the coming months and also next year. So there is a brief indication in the box on the slide. And the CBAM in that way is also living organism because the regulation itself envisages that the scope of the EU CBAM will be gradually expanded to cover more products and essentially to mirror the product coverage of the EU ETS. So what is covered by the EU CBAM? Currently, the EU CBAM applies to products in 6 sectors. So it's cement, iron and steel, aluminum, fertilizers, electricity, and hydrogen. The CBAM, the EU CBAM, applies both to direct emissions and to indirect emissions. However, during the definitive period, the indirect emissions will be taken into account only for cement and fertilizers. And in the future, the scope, the coverage of indirect emissions also should be expanded to other products. For those in the audience who might not know the difference between the direct emissions and the indirect emissions, so essentially the direct emissions are the emissions that are arising directly from the production process of the product in question. And the indirect emissions relate to emissions from the production of electricity that was subsequently used for the production of the product subject to the EU CBAM. So essentially, these are electricity-related emissions. In terms of geographical scope, it applies to imports from all countries, except very limited exception. So there is an exception for third countries that directly apply the EU emission trading scheme. These are the EEA countries. And also there is an exception for third countries that have a domestic emission trading scheme that is linked to the EU ETS. And currently there is only one country that has such a formal linking agreement, and this is Switzerland. There are also limited exemptions for certain situations. So the first one is for low value shipments. And in particular, it applies to products that otherwise would fall within the EU CBAM. But the consignment has a low value of up to 150 euro. In that case, for that specific consignment, there would be no need to comply with the CBAM obligations. The second limited exemption exists for goods moved or used between military forces in the context of military activities, and thus, again, it's very limited in scope and applies in this very particular situation. So, as I have mentioned, the EU CBAM applies to the 6 sectors. However, the specific scope, the specific list of products that are subject to the EU CBAM is contained in Annex 1 to the EU CBAM regulation. This list contains a reference to the HS codes, so CN or HS codes, customs classification of the products, and then the description of the respective code. I would like to note here that the list covers both basic products, which are in the context of the regulation called simple goods. So for instance, unwrought aluminum or cement clinker, but it also includes some complex goods. So for instance, these are aluminum cans, cement, certain products from iron and steel, for instance, nuts and bolts. So really processed products. And for details of the distinction between the simple goods and the complex goods, I would advise to consult the CBAM implementing regulation. Now, as I have mentioned, there is a possibility to expand the scope of the CBAM regulation. And according to the time frame envisaged by the European Union, the first expansion can already happen next year. So the Commission is required to present a report on products further down the value chain, so even more processed products, as compared to the goods listed in Annex 1 by 31st December 2024, with a view to include these products in the scope of the CBAM. By the end of 2025, the European Commission is also required to provide a report on the possibility to extend the scope of the regulation to other goods, so in other sectors at risk of carbon leakage. And specifically, the regulation already refers to organic chemicals and polymers as the next suspects to be included in the scope. And then, without any specific indication of the time frame, the Commission can react by adding relevant, slightly modified products to the list in Annex 1 for anti-circumvention purposes. So that essentially can come at any time. And the reason why I have mentioned this in quite some detail is to say that even if at this point of time you have checked Annex 1 to the EU CBAM and you currently do not export products that are covered by the EU CBAM to the EU, that doesn't mean that in the future the situation will remain the same. So that is just to alert that it is important to follow further developments as regards the EU CBAM in the coming months and years. As I have alluded to in the beginning of the presentation, there are two main phases of the EU CBAM implementation, and the main difference between the two phases is in the key obligations. So the transitional period that runs from the 1st October to 1st October 2023 to 31st December 2025, the core obligation is to report embedded emissions, both direct and indirect, and also to report the carbon price due in the country of origin. These embedded emissions do not need to be verified, and there is no financial obligation arising from the embedded emissions. However, for the failure to comply with the reporting obligations, there are certain penalties envisaged. For the definitive periods, the main difference is in the introduction of the financial obligation, but also it will be necessary for the importer to apply for authorization. So there will be a requirement to apply for authorization to be able to import products subject to CBAM from January 2026. And also there will be an obligation to verify the emissions, embedded emissions that are reported. Moreover, there will be an opportunity for foreign operators or foreign producers that are exporting to the EU to register in the CBAM registry, that is essentially an electronic system, and to provide their verified embedded emissions, which would simplify the reporting of this or the provision of the information on the embedded emissions to the EU importers. And we will talk in a moment how that works in practice. So this slide essentially presents an overview of what's going to happen during the transitional period. As you can see on this slide, the key obligation, the reporting obligation during the transitional period is on the EU importer, or alternatively on the indirect customs representative, on the EU indirect customs representative. However, these direct obligations, of course, result in indirect obligations for non-EU producers, because in order for EU importers to report the data on the embedded emissions in the imported product, they will need this information on the embedded emissions to be provided by non-EU producers. So essentially, the CBAM results in indirect obligations for non-EU producers. So what does the reporting obligation entails? During the transitional period, there is a quarterly reporting obligation, an obligation to submit the so-called CBAM reports through the CBAM transitional registry, which is, as I mentioned, essentially an electronic database provided by the European Union. The obligation to file reports is on EU importers and indirect customs representatives. And the CBAM report must be filed no later than 1 month after the end of each quarter. So for instance, the first quarter of the transitional period was Q4 of 2023, and the first CBAM report was due by 31st January 2024. What has to be reported in this CBAM reports? Quite straightforward: total quantity of each type of imported goods, embedded emissions, so total embedded emissions and total indirect emissions, and as I have mentioned, also the carbon price due in the country of origin. At the beginning of the implementation of the CBAM, there have been some technical issues, and so the European Commission allowed for additional flexibilities in submitting the first CBAM reports. However, beyond those additional flexibilities, there is also a right, an opportunity for the EU importers to modify or correct the data that is included in the CBAM report within 2 months after the end of the relevant reporting quarter. And then there is special, also an opportunity to request a special authorization from EU member state authorities to introduce further modifications. So the main contact point for importers are the EU member state authorities. The Commission can also provide certain clarifications, but essentially everything what relates to the reporting and the implementation of this reporting obligation is handled by the competent authorities of each member state. And the list of those competent authorities is provided on the EU Commission's website. So, as I have mentioned, the emission data will have to be provided by third country operators, so non-EU operators. The implementing regulation envisages that, as a general rule, the third country operators should provide the data on emissions based on, or calculated based on the EU ETS methodologies that are adapted to products. And there are 2 broad calculation methods. For complex goods, there is also a possibility to use the fixed default values that are provided by the European Commission, but only up to 20% of the total embedded emissions. So you can use it only for some minor inputs or for some minor processes that do not exceed this 20% threshold. There are two main derogations from this general or basic rule. The first one has already expired. So by the end of July 2020, or until the end of July of 2024, there was a possibility for EU importers to rely on default values that are provided by the European Commission. So these are like fixed values, emission values for specific products and processes. However, this possibility is no longer there. A second temporary derogation is available until the 31st December 2024, so until the end of this year, and it essentially allows to calculate emissions based on the methodology used under third country national monitoring system that leads to similar coverage and accuracy of emissions data as compared to the EU methodology. What we understand based on our experience as we are advising on the EU CBAM companies both inside the EU and outside of the EU, essentially the European Commission has so far not indicated which other methodologies it considers to be equivalent, but it is likely that it will accept the calculations based on the most widespread methodologies, such as, for instance, the relevant ISO standard 14067, or, for instance, the greenhouse gas protocol standards. So the purpose of this whole reporting obligation is essentially to collect data and then to see if any adjustments need to be done in the methodology for the definitive periods. As I have mentioned, there will be maybe just one more point on the calculation of emissions. So the emissions will need to be calculated and reported on the products, and they include the emissions, so the direct emissions from the production of the product itself, the indirect emissions from the electricity used in the production of the product, but also the direct and indirect emissions embedded in the input, certain input materials, the so-called precursors. So in technical terms, which I think might be familiar to some of you in the audience, this encompasses essentially scope 1, scope 2, and partly scope 3 emissions. The reporting obligation also encompasses the obligation to report domestic carbon price, and there is a list of information that is required. And importantly, as in the case of reporting embedded emissions, the domestic carbon price needs to be reported both for the end product that is exported to the EU, but also for the precursors, so for the input materials, certain input materials that are contained in the final product. To understand exactly the scope of the information requirements for third country operators, so the information that foreign producers will need to provide to EU importers, you may wish to consult Annex 4 of the implementing regulation to the EU CBAM, which essentially contains a communication template from operators, foreign operators of installations to EU importers. And it lists a mandatory information, optional information, and then also sector-specific parameters. There is also a reporting template, which is essentially an interactive and interlinked spreadsheet tool that can be used by reporting declarants, but obviously it's also helpful for foreign producers. And we note that some EU importers prefer to use specific IT tools that have been set up by some service providers, third-party service providers, that facilitate CBAM reporting. So your business partners in the EU may in fact ask you to use this specific IT tools. During the definitive period, as I have mentioned, there is essentially an obligation for the EU importer to apply for authorization, again, to submit the CBAM declaration with the necessary information on the embedded emissions and the carbon price, and also to purchase and surrender CBAM certificates, which is essentially the financial obligation under the EU CBAM. For third country producers during the definitive periods, the main additional obligation is that they will not only need to monitor and calculate the embedded emissions, but also will need to verify them. And as I have mentioned, there will be an opportunity to register their data directly in the CBAM registry. And then this will be essentially the central data point. And EU operators will be able, upon authorization from the non-EU producers, to access this data on the CBAM registry. So essentially, in simple words, what that will mean is that the EU producer, the non-EU producer, so third country producer, will be able to tell to all its EU business partners to refer to the data, verified emission data on the CBAM registry, instead of communicating bilaterally and providing data bilaterally to each EU business partner. I would just like to briefly mention a few key points for the definitive periods. Obviously, it is in the future, but just for general understanding, during the definitive periods, the Commission and the European Union in general will be giving preference to the reporting based on the actual emission data. So they really want to see the actual emission data. However, where there will be no readily available actual emission data, for instance, the emissions have not been verified or cannot be adequately determined, then there will be an opportunity to rely on the so-called default values. So again, the set values. These values are not yet available. And unlike during the transitional period, the default values during the definitive period will likely be of punitive nature. So the goal of these default values will be to force foreign producers to monitor and report the actual emissions. As I have mentioned, during the definitive period, there will be this financial obligation, so the obligation to pay for the carbon emissions embedded in the imported product, and it will be operationalized through the so-called CBAM certificates. So this will be electronic certificates that will correspond to 1 ton of embedded emissions in the covered goods. The price of CBAM certificates will be based on average weekly auction price of the EU ETS allowances, and currently it's about 80 to 90 euro. Unlike under the EU ETS, there will be no secondary markets for the CBAM certificates. So the CBAM certificates will be sold by member state authorities, and there will be just a limited opportunity to resell back the unused CBAM certificates to the member state authorities at the price at which they have been purchased. And there will be also time limitations for this type of transaction. What is important also to note that for the definitive periods, the carbon price, explicit carbon price paid abroad will play an important role, because the financial obligation for the imported products will be adjusted to take into account the carbon price that was already paid on that product. And there will be also evidentiary requirement to prove that this carbon price has been in fact paid. In addition, the financial obligation will be also adjusted to reflect the phase out of the EU ETS free emission allowances, which you may know exist under the EU emission trading scheme. And essentially what will happen is that starting from 2026 until 2034, the free emission allowances will be gradually phased out in the European Union, and correspondingly the CBAM financial obligation will be phased in. The exact calculations, so the exact formulas, how this will be done, how the calculations will be done, are not yet available, but there will be future implementing acts that will set more detailed rules in that regard. As I have mentioned, there will be sanctions both during the transitional period and the definitive period, and the member state authorities will play a key role in enforcing the obligations, both now during the transitional period and also during the definitive period. In case you would like to get some additional guidance on the EU CBAM, there is a very useful platform that is provided by the European Commission. It contains links to the relevant legal acts. Also, the European Commission has prepared guidance for importers, but also for non-EU operators, available in a number of languages. Also, a very useful document is the frequently asked questions that the European Commission updates regularly. For instance, the last update was done just in August, so a few weeks ago. And there are also a number of training materials, including webinar recordings and e-learnings, which are very helpful, in particular for SMEs, if you want to understand better, for instance, how the CBAM applies to a particular sector in which you are active. Finally, what are the implications of the EU CBAM for small and medium enterprises? As you have seen, there are no exemptions from this regulatory framework, from these obligations for SMEs. So SMEs must ensure compliance with CBAM if they act as EU importers, or if they are foreign producers that export products subject to the CBAM to the EU. Hence, it is advisable to carefully check if the products that you export or you import are subject to the EU CBAM. So as I have mentioned, check Annex 1 to the EU CBAM regulation with the list and the customs reference to the customs codes. And please note that this list includes really many downstream products. For instance, screws, bolts, nuts made of iron and steel. Because in our experience, and we understand there have been also reports from national competent authorities, that a lot of companies, especially SMEs, are just not aware that EU CBAM may affect them, may apply to them. What could be relevant for SMEs is the de minimis exemption. So as I have mentioned at the beginning, it applies to consignments up to the total value of CBAM goods of 150 euro. And in the recent FAQs, the Commission has clarified what it means under the single consignment. So if your consignment of the CBAM goods meets this conditions, then you could, as an EU importer, essentially opt for exemption, so not report the relevant data. Or if you're an exporter and you see that your consignment meets these requirements, you can also inform your EU business partner, the EU importer, that there is an exemption in place. And finally, it is advisable to keep an eye on the forthcoming developments, and in particular, the expansion of the product scope of the EU CBAM, and also on the carbon border adjustments in other jurisdictions, because of course, after the introduction of the EU CBAM, other countries have been also actively discussing the introduction of similar carbon border adjustment mechanism, and the most advanced discussions are currently in the UK, which will likely introduce its own carbon border adjustment mechanism in January 2027. And there will be, in fact, some differences between the UK CBAM and the EU CBAM, including in the scope. So it is really important to follow the carbon border adjustment discussion, not only in the EU, but also in other key jurisdictions to which you might be exporting your products. This concludes my presentation. Thank you so much for your attention. I hope it was useful, and I'm happy to answer some of the questions that you may have within the time available. Thank you.
Sergiana, thank you so much. I know it was a lot of information all together, but you managed to explain it in a really clear way. So I really appreciate that. It was incredible. So congratulations. I can see there's some reaction from the audience, some hearts, some claps, some fingers up. So it seems that this is spread to all the audience. We indeed have a lot of questions. So we will try to cover most of them. And one of them says from A. Barcy, it's asking, when you mention indirect emissions, it means organizational footprint with the LCA approach, but not product footprint, isn't it?
So indirect emissions refer to emissions related to electricity. So let's say in the production process of the good that is covered by the EU CBAM, you would consume some electricity. And when the electricity is produced by electricity generator, there might be some emissions related to the production of electricity. So the indirect emissions relate to the emissions that were produced when electricity was generated. So it's essentially embedded emissions embedded in the electricity that are used in the production of the product subject to the CBAM.
Super clear. And here there's a question that it's repeated. One of the person who is asking, it's Fausto again, and he's asking, thanks for the session, the emissions report, should they be certified by a third party or an authority, or just by the exporter?
So during the transitional period, thankfully, there is no obligation to verify, so to certify, to have a third-party certification of the emissions that you indicate in your report to the EU importer. Or if you're an EU importer and you submit this report to member state authorities, there is no need to provide any additional certificate or verification.
Nice. And here, talking about certificates, another participant is asking, would the CBAM need to be submitting alongside certificate of origin? Is that
certificate of origin? No, there is no requirement to submit a certificate of origin, but I don't know exactly in what context that question arises.
Sure. So there, the participant who asked if you can provide more information, then we can dig deeper into it. Is there any benefit for those enterprises who use solar energy in this context?
Yes, so essentially, if you're using solar energy, of course, the indirect emission footprint will be lower or non-existent because if there are no embedded emissions in electricity, then for your reporting purposes, it will be essentially zero. But there are certain rules that apply on how to provide the data on the indirect emissions in case where electricity is not produced on the site.
And here, background, it's asking specifically about Scope 3 progress. And if you know when a definitive methodology and the expanse of coverage of Scope 3 will be available.
So as regards the expansion of the coverage of emissions to Scope 3, and I understand that what is meant here are, for instance, Scope 3 emissions that are currently not covered by the EU CBAM, there is no specific timeline. So as far as we understand, currently the focus of the Commission is foremost to expand the product scope, and then also to take into account indirect emissions for all the sectors that are covered by the EU CBAM.
And here, there are two questions that are related. One is, do you foresee that the obligation may extend to primary products such as beef? And then if you could repeat the main sectors that the instrument applied to. Remember, that's just a caveat here. We will send the presentation and also the recording tomorrow by email. So if everyone needs to re-watch something or relive something, you will have the recordings in all 3 languages. But do you see that maybe this could extend to additional products?
So when thinking about the extension or expansion of the EU CBAM to other products, you always need to have in mind the EU emission trading scheme. So if certain sectors are not covered by the EU emission trading scheme, it's not possible that CBAM will be expanded to those sectors or will include those sectors, because essentially what the CBAM does, it's kind of mirroring, or the idea is that it will mirror the ETS for imported products.
I see. Well, there are a lot of additional questions. I think that because of the time, we are not able to go through all of them. But you have my contact, so you can forward all the questions to me, and then we can forward them to Tatiana. But really appreciate, Tatiana, this incredible, awesome presentation that you just gave to all of us. You share some of your knowledge with us, so I really appreciate that. I would like to thank you. Starting in just 1 minute. So I encourage everyone to come back slowly. I know it was an intensive first session, but it was really enriching. And now we have more topics, information coming. This second session of the day. So before giving the floor to our next speaker, just for those who maybe joined for this second session and you missed the first part, we have live interpretation and simultaneous interpretation in all 3 languages, English, Spanish, and Portuguese. So if you would like to listen to this session in any of the other languages, but English, you can just activate the simultaneous interpretation option by clicking on the word icon that is on the bottom part of the Zoom window. You can just click in there and then select either Spanish or Portuguese, since the sessions and the Q&A part will be conducted exclusively in English. Para los que hablan español y se conectaron recién y se perdieron la primera parte, sepan que hay interpretación simultánea en vivo en español, así que los que quieran activar esta opción van a poder ir a la pestaña de Zoom. Abajo de todo está la opción de interpretación simultánea y ahí van a poder seleccionar el español. Tengan en cuenta que tanto la sesión, la presentación, como la parte de preguntas y respuestas va a ser exclusivamente en inglés, así que no se olviden de activar aí la opção de interpretação simultânea. E para os brasileiros, o pessoal que fala português, saibam que a próxima sessão vai ser também exclusivamente em inglês. Então, aqueles que querem ouvir a apresentação em português, a gente tem a opção de interpretação simultânea ao vivo. Então, para ativar ela, você só precisa ir para a parte inferior aí embaixo da janela do Zoom e fazer clique na opção do mundo e aí ativar a língua português. Porque a sessão vai ser exclusivamente em inglês. Também vocês podem deixar suas perguntas em português, que depois, quando a palestrante responde elas, vocês vão poder ouvir a resposta em português. Now I will switch again to English. So we will start with this second session of the day. More interesting topics coming, a lot of really interesting information that we all need to know about the Green Deal. And this time it will be Clotilde Duport who will be leading this second part. So Clotilde, thank you for being here with us today, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you especially Ulas and Luciano for inviting me to this webinar. I'm going and well, good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone all over the world. I'm going to talk today about another topic relating to the Green Deal, which is the European Union Deforestation Regulation. It's also, as with the CBAM, it's a cross-sectoral piece of legislation, meaning that it applies to different sectors. So let me share my screen. So my presentation will be in two parts. I will first talk about the regulation and the different aspects, everything you need to know about the deforestation regulation. And then the second part will be, why is this regulation relevant for non-EU businesses? So for you who are in different countries in the world which are non-EU countries. So let's first start with an overview of the deforestation regulation. So the deforestation regulation, I mean, the main action of this regulation is to regulate, and in fact to prohibit the placing and making available on the EU market, as well as exporting from the EU market, covered products that are not deforestation free. This is to make it short, but this gives an idea of what this regulation is about. So the rationale of the regulation is how to reduce the contribution of EU consumption to deforestation and forest degradation. In fact, the Commission, I mean, in order to draft this regulation, has wondered how, what kind of rules can we lay down in order to reduce the contribution of EU consumption to deforestation. And the outcome has been this regulation, which, as you can see, I mean, in the second part of the slide, has entered into force already last year in June 2023. However, even though it has already entered into force, it's not yet implemented. The regulation provided for a certain time period before full implementation. And the full implementation will actually take place at the end of this year, on 30 December 2024, except for micro and small undertakings, which will have until end of June 2025 to implement. So why a lapse of time of 18 months between the entry into force and the full implementation? I mean, this is because basically, on the one hand, the European Commission needed time to adopt certain implementing acts, and as we will talk about them in the course of this presentation. And on the other hand, this time is also necessary for all businesses to be prepared to comply with all these new obligations of the Deforestation Regulation. The other dates, I will talk about them in the course of this presentation. So I mentioned that the main action of the regulation is to prohibit placing and making available on the EU market and exporting from the EU market those products that are not deforestation free. So the first question is, how do we understand the term placing on the market? And there you will have a definition in the regulation, which is that the placing on the market is when you make available the relevant commodity or product for the first time. And making available on the market, in turn, is when you supply a relevant product for distribution, consumption, or use on the EU market in the course of a commercial activity. So these definitions are important because they will determine the applicability and how the obligation under the regulations apply. Entering into the details of the regulation, we will first address the issue of the scope. So the first scope is the product scope. To which product does this regulation applies? And there you have 7 categories of commodities and derived products that are subject to the regulation. You can see them on your screen. It's cattle, rubber, cocoa, soya, coffee, wood, and oil palm. So the regulation applied to the commodities, but also a number of derived products. Importantly, all the products that are subject to the regulation are listed in Annex 1 to the regulation. So if you wonder whether your product is covered by the regulation, you need to go to Annex 1 of the regulation and check whether your product is covered by the description, one of the description in that list. There is the Annex 1 not only include a description, but also the relevant HS or CN code. It's very important to underline once again that only products that are included in Annex 1 are covered. So the Commission, for instance, give the example of a product that, even though it contains one of the commodities that are covered by the regulation, is not in itself coming within the scope of the regulation. This is, for instance, soap containing palm oil. Palm oil is one of the commodity that is covered, but soap is not in Annex 1 of the regulation, and is therefore not covered. Also, it's important to remember that this scope is the one that is currently existing, but it may be amended and in particular broadened in the future. The Commission is requested by 13 June 2025 to possibly amend the scope, either by adding products within list Annex 1 of the regulation, for instance, because some derived products of cocoa have not been indicated and it's necessary to add them, or also potentially by adding new commodities. One of them is specifically mentioned in the regulation. This is maize. So whether maize will be added to the product scope is something on which the Commission will have to work and make an assessment report later on. The geographical coverage. The question is whether it's restricted to some countries in the world. The response is no. The regulation applies wherever the products come from, including from the EU itself. So, for instance, wood produced in the EU will also have to comply with the obligations of the regulation. Now, we will see later that distinction can be made between countries or regions pursuant to a risk assessment under the benchmarking system that the Commission is currently making. The last type of scope or coverage is temporal. I have mentioned that the regulation entered into force on 29 June 2023, but that full implementation will only take place by 30 December 2024, meaning that operators and traders will have to comply with the requirement of the regulation by 30 December 2024. So products that are placed on the EU market as of 13 December 2024 will have to comply with the requirements of the regulation. Now, because the regulation entered into force on 19 June 2023, products that have been produced before that date do not enter within the scope of the regulation. Finally, another date that is important to keep in mind is 31st December 2020, because it's relevant in the framework of the definition of deforestation, as I will explain in a moment. So that's for the scope. Now, the main obligations laid down in the Deforestation Regulation. So the regulation prohibits to place or make available on the EU market and to export from the EU market the covered products. So we have seen which products are covered. If those products are not, and there are three conditions, those products must be deforestation-free, they must be produced in accordance with the relevant legislation of the country of origin, of production, and they must be covered by a due diligence statement. The due diligence statement is a statement that will be issued at the end of a due diligence process. The purpose of the due diligence process is precisely to ensure that the first two substantive conditions are fulfilled. So make sure that the products are deforestation-free and produced in accordance with the relevant legislation of the country of production. If the products, if you place on the market, on the EU market, a covered product, and you cannot demonstrate that they are deforestation-free and produced in accordance with the relevant legislation of the country of production, they cannot be placed on the EU market, nor exported from the EU market. those obligations to which businesses or to which person will this obligation apply. There are two key, I would say, key categories that are concerned: the operators and the traders. So an operator is a natural or legal person who, in the course of a commercial activity, places the covered products on the EU market or export them from the EU market. So as I mentioned already, placing on a market means you make first available a covered product on the EU market, and it must be in the course of a commercial activity. SME operators are exempted from certain due diligence obligation if a due diligence statement has already been submitted. Traders refers to any person in the supply chain other than an operator who, in the course of a commercial activity, makes available on the EU market the covered products. In other words, it refers to someone further down in the supply chain on the EU market. So these two categories will be subject or are subject to the obligations, or to some obligation under the Deforestation Regulation. So you will remember that there are three main requirements before you can place or make available covered products on the EU market. And the first obligation is that the products must be deforestation free. Deforestation free means for all products that they must contain or have been fed with or have been made using commodities that are produced on land that has not been subject to deforestation after 31st December 2020. So if a product has been produced on land that has been subject to deforestation before that date, it's not an issue under the regulation. The cutoff date is 31st December 2020, and that's similar for products containing or made using wood, because there is a requirement also that this has not been made, this has not induced forest degradation. What is deforestation? Deforestation is defined in the regulation as the conversion of forest into agricultural use, whether human-induced or not. So that's the definition. And for forest degradation, you also have a definition that you can see on the screen, and that is included in the regulation. You have also a technical definition of what is a forest, and that may change also in the future if in case the Commission assess that it's not completely working properly. The second condition, the second substantive condition in order for a product to be compliant with the deforestation regulation is that the product must be compliant with the relevant legislation of the country of production. When the regulation refers to legislation of the country of production, it actually covers different categories of legislation, including land use rights, environmental protection, human rights, labor rights. So this is relatively broad and not yet completely clear how it will be assessed whether the risk compliance with those different elements. Finally, so I have mentioned the deforestation-free status, the fact that the products must be compliant with the domestic legislation of the country of production. The third element is the issuance of a due diligence statement. Due diligence statement will have to be issued by the operator, and the operator will only be able to issue a due diligence statement after having carried out a due diligence process. The due diligence process has 3 steps, as you can see on this slide, and we will review in more details what each step entails. So the first step of this due diligence process relates to information gathering and collection. So the operator will have to collect, organize, and keep for 5 years from the date of placing the relevant commodities or products on the EU market a number of information and documents. The first information element is the description of the products, including trade name and type of relevant products, also the quantity. You will have to, the operator will have to identify the country of production. Very important, it will have to collect the geolocation of all plots of land where relevant commodities have been produced, as well as relevant dates. Geolocation of plots of land means basically you have to identify very precisely where the relevant commodities have been produced. And there is a distinction made depending on the size of the plot of land, whether it's bigger than 4 hectares or smaller than 4 hectares, but it must refer to latitude and longitude with 6 decimal digits. That's very important as part of the elements and the information that needs to be collected. Following that, the operator will also have to have the contact details of the suppliers as well as the purchasers if he then sells, for instance, the product to a trader. It's very important to gather conclusive and verifiable information that the relevant products are deforestation free, and also that these products have been produced in accordance with the relevant legislation of the country of production. So all this information will have to be collected, organized, and kept in all cases, in order and before the relevant products can be placed on the EU market or exported from the EU market. Then the second step of this due diligence process is the risk assessment. Once the operator has collected all this information and evidence, it must assess the risk and to which extent the covered products it intends to place on the EU market presents a risk associated with deforestation and non-compliance with the relevant legislation of the country of production. And to make that risk assessment, it will have to take into account a number of criteria, including the risk level of the country of production, whether in the country of production or the region of production, forests are present, whether there are indigenous people in those areas of production. Thirdly, whether there is deforestation and forest degradation in the country, whether there are concerns regarding corruption, violation of human rights, armed conflict, sanctions, the complexity of the supply chain and the stage of processing of the relevant products and risk of circumvention, whether there is an history of non-compliance for operators or traders in the supply chain, and any other relevant information. The objective is to make an assessment of as whether there is a risk that the product is somehow associated with deforestation and not produced in accordance with the relevant legislation. And if the conclusion is that there is a no risk or a negligible risk, that's fine. It will be able to issue a due diligence statement and place the product on the EU market. But if there is something more than a negligible risk, then it cannot place that product on the EU market nor export it from the EU market, and it will have to take risk mitigation measures. So that's the third step or aspect of the due diligence process. This is risk mitigation. And in order the risk mitigation measures may include requiring additional information, making additional checks, requesting independent surveys. The purpose is, in any event, to make sure that there is only a negligible risk, because if there is something more than that, the products cannot be placed on the EU market. So it's very demanding in terms of all the information and the evidence that needs to be gathered, and the due diligence that has to be undertaken by the relevant operators on the market. Now, I want to also mention another element, which is the country benchmarking system. The regulation, so as I have mentioned, all countries in the world are, the relevant products must be compliant with this obligation, the regulation, wherever they have been produced in the world. So all countries in the world are somehow, if there are products, wherever those products come from, they will have to comply with this obligation. At the start, the regulation provides that all countries are considered to be standard risk countries or regions. This is what is provided in the regulation. But the regulation also requests, has requested the Commission to look in more details into the risk of the different countries, and possibly to adjust this classification. Some countries or regions might then be classified differently as either low-risk country or high-risk regions or countries. The regulation has requested the Commission to do that by the implementation date, so by 30 December 2024. So normally, by that date, the Commission should have issued an assessment. However, it may not be ready by that time, according to some rumors. But so in the meantime, all countries are considered to be standard risk countries. In order to decide and change the categories of risk, a number of criteria will have to be taken into account, and this includes the rate of deforestation or forest degradation in that country or region, the rate of expansion of agricultural land, and as well as initiatives to tackle deforestation, including bilateral agreements with the EU. Now, this classification of the countries is a very important element, as it has important consequences in at least two respects. First of all, it will determine the percentage of checks that have to be undertaken by the competent authorities in the EU member states. Products that come from high-risk countries will have to be checked. At least 9% of those products will have to be checked by the competent authorities, while it's 3% for standard risk and 1% for low risk. Another important consequence, and that's very important for supply chains, is that if the product comes from a low-risk country, then only the first step of the due diligence process has to be complied with. In other words, if an operator places on the EU market a product that has been produced in a low-risk country, he only has to collect the necessary information and evidence, but no need to make a risk assessment nor risk mitigation, at least if there is no elements or no indication of circumvention, for instance. So typically, this classification of the countries will have important consequences for the supply chains and so for exporters. If you export from a country that will be classified as a low-risk country, it means that the purchaser, which is an operator on the EU market, will have a less burdensome obligations. So that's very important. Now I'll turn to sanctions and enforcement aspect. So the enforcement will take place at the EU member state level. Each and every EU member state has been requested to identify which authority will be the competent authorities within the meaning of the regulation, and this is already public, so you may know for each EU member state who are the competent authorities. And those authorities have an important role because they will have to carry out checks following a risk-based approach, meaning that depending on a certain number of criteria, they have to assess what is the risk, and obviously the higher the risk, then the most frequent they need to make checks and checks whether the relevant products comply with the different obligations of the regulation. So as I have mentioned earlier, the targets are different depending on the classification of the country of production. Finally, the authorities will also have to investigate complaints filed by natural or legal person which demonstrate a substantiated concern. I will just mention it, but it's also an important element, is that any natural or legal person may file a complaint to the competent authorities indicating that but this must be they must demonstrate a substantiated concern, so it must be supported by evidence, by documents that they suspect, for instance, products not to be consistent with the regulation, and the competent authorities will have to follow up on those complaints and decide whether they have to proceed with these complaints. Now, what are the different actions? First of all, you have some interim measures that the competent authorities have to take if there is urgency. And this consists in short-term seizure of product or suspension of placing or making available on the EU market. Then there are corrective actions that will have to be taken by operators or traders if they infringe the obligation under the regulation. And those corrective actions consist in rectifying a formal non-compliance or preventing the product from being placed, made available on, or exported from the market, withdrawing or recalling the product, and finally donating or disposing of the product. In addition to those actions, there will be penalties in case of infringement. Now, the penalties are determined by each member state, but the regulation provides that they will consist in at least fines, at least 4% of the operators or traders' total annual EU-wide turnover. Penalties will include confiscation of products, confiscation of related revenues, temporary exclusion from public procurement or public funding, and also some even stricter penalties in case of serious or repeated infringements. So those are the sanctions, but in addition to that, there is also obviously damage in the reputation if companies do not comply with their obligation under the deforestation regulation. Now, let me turn to this second part of my presentation, which is why is this regulation relevant for you as non-EU businesses? We can, broadly speaking, distinguish two scenarios. If a non-EU company qualifies as and is an operator or trader within the meaning of the EUDR, it will be directly affected, and it will be subject to the due diligence obligation under the deforestation regulation. Another scenario is that the non-EU business does not qualify as an operator or trader within the meaning of the EUDR, but still export covered commodities or covered products to the EU market. Then it will be indirectly affected because the operator to which the non-EU business sells its product will be himself subject to the regulation. The operator will need to collect information, evidence. That operator will ask his supplier, so for instance, the exporter, to provide all the relevant evidence, information, and will also adapt its contracts to make sure that all the information, all the evidence is provided, and also to make sure that the due diligence is also being done upstream in the supply chain. And the risk in case of non-compliance, as I have mentioned already, if you are directly affected, the regulation lays down a number of corrective actions as well as penalties. And I have mentioned the reputational damages. And if the business is not directly affected by the regulation, but indirectly, it means that for instance, the supplier in a non-EU country that is doing business with the EU, but does not have all the information and evidence, this will mean for him a loss of business opportunities on the EU market, because typically the EU operator will be willing to work with suppliers who can show that they have all the necessary evidence and information that they can demonstrate that the products they export to the EU market are deforestation free and comply with the relevant legislation of the country of production. Also, this can result in damages following contractual clauses to the extent that the contract between the EU operators and the non-EU supplier contains contractual clauses providing for damages in case of non-compliance with some of the due diligence aspects under the regulation. So, I mean, maybe in terms of, by way of conclusion, I would say that what is very important for any business is, first of all, to understand whether his products are covered products within the meaning of the deforestation regulation. And then if it's the products sold are covered products, then it's very, and as a second step, understand whether and what is the role of that business, the role, I mean, and whether it qualifies as operator or trader within the meaning of the regulation. Then I think that's two main elements. Obviously, there are many other considerations that would need to be taken into account if you are, and in case you are subject to somehow to the obligation under the deforestation regulation. Well, this ends my presentation for today, and I'm also ready to answer some of your questions if you have any. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Clotilde. That was really an impressive educational session. So thank you so much for sharing with us all your knowledge. And we indeed have a lot, and I mean it, a lot of questions. We'll try to cover at least some of them here. And again, a lot of people is asking about the recording, that they miss a part or something. So just for you to know, we will send the recording of this session in all 3 languages, Spanish, English, and Portuguese, tomorrow. So if you miss any part, you will be able to watch the recording from tomorrow. One question that actually is being repeated a lot here, and that you actually mentioned this, but maybe it will be useful to repeat this. It's about the list of country regions with the low standard or high risks, where people can find this list and this benchmark.
Thank you very much for the question. Actually, it's not yet, the Commission is working on it. So as things stand today, all countries, all regions in the world are considered to be standard risk regions and countries. So I would say that today there is no list. And normally, according to what is provided in the regulation, the Commission should communicate that list or adopt that list by 30 December 2024.
Great.
Maybe something I have not mentioned, but that's useful to know. So you have the regulation, and today you also, you also have available on the website of the Commission a list of Q&A that will be helpful to clarify a number of elements. Those question and answers should be updated in the coming weeks. And the Commission should also issue a guidance document in the coming months. So these are new elements that we expect from the Commission.
That's really a good tip. So you can just go to the website and check it. Otherwise, we will also on the follow-up email, we'll look for this section and just send you all the link so you can access it directly. So this is another question that you already went through during your presentation, and it's about the definition of forest. And here there is a bit of a specific question. If you know about planted forests, count as a forest for this purpose within these regulations? Do you know?
The definition of forest that you find in the regulation is land spanning more than 0.5 hectares with trees higher than 5 meters and a canopy cover of more than 10% of or trees able to reach those thresholds in situ, excluding land that is predominantly under agricultural or human land use.
Right.
So that's the technical definition.
Perfect. Awesome. And talking about definition, I don't know if there is also a definition because you mentioned that there are some particular processes for SMEs. Is there a specific definition of SME within the context of these regulations?
I think it refers back to another regulation. Let me check. SMEs, it's the definition that you can find in Article 3 of Directive 2013/34 of the European Union. So if you go to that directive, Article 3, you will find the definition that applies in the context of the deforestation regulation.
Perfect. Awesome. And here, Kim is asking, if I am understanding it correctly, the responsibility of the due diligence will fall exclusively to the operator and not the trader?
No, I mean, the operator is the first in line for this due diligence, but the trader also have to file a due diligence statement. So there are also due diligence obligation applying to traders, not only to operators.
Good. And I want to hear from Farid Mohammed. For example, if a coffee producing country has a small portion of disqualified land, does that mean that all the coffee from that country cannot be accepted into the EU, or does the requirement apply to land used only by that individual operator?
What will be relevant is for the producer in that country to show that the coffee beans come from a land that has not been subject to deforestation. So even if another producer in the country, produces coffee that on a land that has been subject to deforestation, but it's not this. This is per plot of lands that you have to show the absence of deforestation.
And here one really important question concerning the audience and all the language is here spoken. For all the documents that are necessary for the due diligence process, can we submit them in the language they were written, for instance, Spanish, Portuguese, etc., or will they have to be translated into specific language? Should they be translated just in the language of the member state concerned, or just in English, or both?
I must say, I don't know.
Okay, no problem.
Yeah.
We can check it, and then this is Philip handling. So Philip, if you send me an email, I left my contact there. If you send me an email, we can check this information and then get back to you again. And there was here another important question. There are a lot, so I'm missing them. Here, once once we systematize all the documentation, is there any specific way that it has to be presented for the verification?
No, the maybe also something that I need to mention is that it's so the burden will be on the operators and traders to show that they have made their due diligence. So this is for them to, on the basis of the evidence they have, to show that there is no risk or a negligible risk. And in fact, the due diligence statement will have to be transmitted to the competent authorities through a so-called information system. So it's a platform. And so that platform is, I mean, now the Commission, they have, it's in the process of being established, and by 30 December 2024, so this information system will have to be in place, and all the due diligence statements will have to be uploaded through that system. But yeah, that's how things are.
Great, perfect. Thank you so much. We reached over 150 questions there on the Q&A option, so we are not going to be able to go through all of them. So again, if there is an important question that we missed this time here on the live session, feel free to write to me, and I can forward them to the speaker. So with this, I would like to thank you, Clotilde, for this excellent presentation that you did and for sharing all your knowledge with all of us.
Thank you very much to you and all participants to this webinar.
Thank you. And I have some information about the participation certificate. I know that a lot of you are interested in this, but before that, I would like to thank you also, Ulas and Catherine from the ICC, always that every time that you see an initiative or an activity that it's made all together in collaboration with the ICC, it's Ulas, the mastermind behind all that incredible work. So I also would like to thank you, Ulas and Catherine, for your great effort on this. And let me share quickly my screen so you have the information about the participation certificate. So here you have the QR codes. So for those that stay here, or even if you miss any part, know that we will send the recordings to your email by tomorrow. But if you would like to ask for or request the certificate of participation, you can just scan these QR codes. It's in all 3 languages, English, Spanish, and Portuguese, because there are some extra questions there to get some feedback from you about what could we do next for our next program. So there you just leave your information, and we will get in contact with you and send the certificate soon in the upcoming weeks. So thank you so much. I will just leave this for a couple of seconds so you can scan the QR code. But I would like to thank you all for being here. We reached over 900 participants during this session, and we have represented over 120 countries connected. So that's incredible. It's a really international session that we had today with the ICC. So again, thank you, Ulas, Catherine, also the team that is behind the scenes, Isabella, Rosillo, and of course Tatiana and Clotilde for their presentations, and to all of you that were part of this session. We have a lot of new activities coming in the following weeks, also talking and deepening about how to export to European markets. So we will be launching a new registration form about a new cycle, a new Semana Comics, as the one that we did in the past, specifically on how to export to European markets. So just get in contact with us. You will receive an email with all the contact information of the speakers, also my contact information in case you would like to ask me anything about Connect Americas, Bid for the Americas, or any other program. And thank you so much. Again, we will be in touch soon. Have a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.